So thanks so much for coming, everybody. And yeah, really, really looking forward to this discussion. It's such an interesting one that we've got going on this evening. So for a bit of context, we always have some old faces, some new faces, which is really nice and helps keep the discussion really fresh and energizing. I'm Anna. I set up and coordinate the book club with Chloe, who's also on the call. And as most of you know, this is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance's book club. So it's really about us informing ourselves about how to build an economy with people and planet at its core, so that we are then more informed as we go about actually building it. Chloe's going to be running the session this evening, so thank you, Chloe, and I'll hand over to her just shortly. It would be, I was going to say it'd be nice if you could put your names in the chat, but actually we might go around individually and just introduce ourselves, since we're a nice intimate group this evening. For anyone who might be visually impaired or who can't see me if you're on the move, I'm blonde and I've got a black jumper on. Chloe has brown hair and has also got a black but slightly more colourful jumper on. And lastly, I would really just like to draw on the fact that it has become quite common practice in North America and in other places to acknowledge the land which we are on when we are holding events like these. So I would, I'm based in Britain. I'm not sure where everybody else is dialing in from, but I'd like to take a moment to really acknowledge Britain's involvement in widespread suffering throughout the world in the past, in the present, and most likely also in the future as well, and think that it's really important to acknowledge this in order to have a candid discussion as we move forward. So thanks so much to Chloe for leading the session, and also to Nisreen for joining. This is amazingly exciting, and we'll be hearing from you and capturing as much of your wisdom as we can shortly. But yeah, Chloe, I'm not sure if you'd like to kick off.
Hi everyone, thanks Anna for that lovely intro. Yeah, Anna and I go way back in different ways. I currently work in environmental advocacy and yeah, just love the book club discussions. I'm not too far away from Anna in London, and I think what I'm really excited about this evening is just really getting stuck into some of the ideas in the book, and then kind of, yeah, really hearing an activist in practice and someone who can provide some real reflection on the ideas that we've been talking about when we talk to Nisreen in the second half of this session. So that's me, and should I pass over to, is it Loic?
Yes, hi, I'm Loic. I'm based up in Glasgow in Scotland. So for anybody who's not from the UK, I don't know where people are dialing in from, but yeah, I'm here from Ireland. I've been in Scotland for 6 years, 5 years, coming on 6 years. Yeah, and I'm interested to hear this session. I think is interesting to me as well, because I think a lot of the other sessions that have been more about kind of the theory of the economics and the like, and this one's a bit more about action, which, having been in Glasgow over COP26 and seen some of the things around that, I think is, for me, I'm definitely very interested to hear more about things to do and things that would be kind of useful to do as a contribution in this session. So yeah, I'll pass on to, is it Esther?
Hello?
That's better. Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah, I'm Esther. Hello. I'm based in Lancaster, and I work with a group called Animal Think Tank, and we want to help seed a social movement for animal justice in the next couple of years. So kind of like, we kind of use this theory of change in terms of like civil disobedience and mass organizing and mobilizing and things like that. So yeah, we share a similar theory of change to Extinction Rebellion, but at the same time we want to do things differently. So yeah, I'm excited to excited for this session.
Do you want to pass on to someone else?
Yeah, I'll pass on to Catherine.
Hey, yes, I'm Catherine and I'm living and studying in the Netherlands. And yeah, I don't know, I just saw the event, or the event was promoted in the WEAll Youth WhatsApp group chat. And I don't know, I thought it sounds really interesting. And then, I don't know, I just signed up for it and here I am. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you, exchanging ideas and experiences, and just, yeah, just seeing where the conversation goes, I guess. Yeah. And then I'm handing on to Anna, right? It's your turn.
I guess then the second Anna. Yes, hi. I'm also, I'm calling from Hungary. I'm dialing in from Hungary. And I know Esther and I know Animal Think Tank. And the leader of Animal Think Tank is the one who shared this opportunity to join this session today. And I managed to come back in time from my program, so I decided to join in. And I'm very open to everything what you're talking about, the theory of change, and I'm here to learn and listen. And I will pass it on to Julie.
Hello, everyone. I am Julie, dialing in from Kenya, Beta specifically, and Chloe and Anna welcomed me to be on board. So I'm very excited to see how we can create this social movement. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. Lovely to hear your voice again. Is there anyone else who hasn't spoken? How about Patience?
Okay, good evening, everyone. So my name is Patience from SY in Ghana, and I'm also here today. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Lovely. I think, is that everyone?
We can't let Nisreen not say hello.
We can't let Nisreen, it's true. If she wants to now, or yeah.
Sure. Hi guys, I'm Nisreen. I'm originally from Sudan. I'm here in London for a few days before I go back, and I'm very glad to be here with you. I'm the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. I'm also the chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, and looking forward. I also had a view on the books, and the book is amazing. So looking forward to hear your discussion and then participate in the later part of it.
Thank you. My sound went a little bit funny there. Thanks, Nisreen. Lovely. So the plan for the session is I'm going to do a quick overview of the 3 books that were set for this session. So we had Bury the Chains, which is about the abolition of slavery, Common Sense for the 21st Century, which is by Roger Hallam, and is kind of an analysis of the ideas behind Extinction Rebellion. And then we have a book about civil resistance by Erica Chenoweth, What You Need to Know. So I'm going to be going through those, getting the bare bones down of the books and asking some hopefully slightly provocative questions that we can discuss together, both talking about the books individually and identifying hopefully some lovely overlaps. So that'll take us to around about 8, where Nisreen will join us in full to really see how her experience, we can fit this within a broader discussion. So I've got some questions prepared. So we'll do those, and then for the last half hour or so of the session, we'll open up, and this is a vague format, by the way. If we decide to go a little bit off piece, this is also completely fine. So you guys can have a chance to ask Nisreen your questions. So I am going to share my screen. Anna, could you let me share my screen?
Does that work?
Yes, it did. Give me a second. Can everyone see this? Lots of bubbles, it should look like. Excellent. And let me start my timer so I don't rabbit on too far. So for full disclosure, I read one book for this session. I didn't read all three. So I'm going to be doing an overview based on the fantastic cheat sheet, the notes that were put together on these. But I very much welcome revisions and suggestions, and we open it up to discussion. So the first book I just wanted to kind of go through the major points of was Civil Resistance, what everyone needs to know. So, sorry, let me zoom in a little bit closer. Basically, this is a rather academic look at what civil resistance is, and Erica defines it in quite a not a narrow way, but she gives a very specific definition. She goes through methods of civil resistance, she goes through examples, she talks about successes and failures. So it's a real academic analysis of what civil resistance is. So her definition of this is a technique of struggle where unarmed civilians use a wide variety of methods to confront an oppressive opponent, the same opponent, without violence. So this is rather protracted normally, together with coordinated groups, and they have the same end goal. So she makes some exclusions. So negotiation and community organization are not strictly civil resistance in her opinion. However, to already slightly not undermine, but provide some caveats perhaps to her definition, she talks about civil resistance as a method of conflict, which brings up some quite interesting questions I think we can talk about with violence. What is violence and how does it fit in with civil resistance? And she does go on to say as well that people should use whatever's considered most appropriate to protect themselves and their communities. We have a tendency to think about non-violent struggles as preferable to violent struggles, but perhaps the question what violence is something we can be questioning later on. She goes through, she says, basically, we are in the age of civil resistance. So 2010 to 2020 has seen more revolutionary non-violent uprisings than any other period. And then she goes on to do this analysis of how change is achieved. She says change is achieved when people change systems, and they do this by pulling the pillars of support away from the power holder. So she identifies these pillars of support quite broadly. So trade unions, wealthy business owners, bureaucrats, judicial staff, media, religious authorities, civil society. So she also acknowledges the really important role that parallel or alternative institutions can play in the success of social movements, but her analysis is about the fact that it's when these kind of nodes of power are flipped and they change the overall whole. Erica is quite famous for something called the 3.5% rule, which I think Anna provided a TED talk link to, which is basically the idea that if you have 3.5% of the population who are behind a movement, then it will succeed. So she actually goes in to slightly undermine this initial argument. She says that she got this 3.5 from data on movements that had happened in the past, and then actually brings up two examples, one in Bahrain and one in Brunei, where they had over 3.5% of the population behind something, and their attempts to change things failed. The saving grace, perhaps, to this is, she says, when 3.5% has succeeded, it might actually be because it represents a bigger proportion of the overall population. But her underlying sort of thesis is pulling the particular pillars of support away from power is how we change things. The 3.5% is not so important. She then goes on to talk about how IT and access to information outside of elite control is a really important tool and a defining feature of civil resistance in these movements in the past 10 years. And ends the book on a slightly sadder note, which is just as civil resistance is becoming the most common approach for revolutionary campaigns, it is also becoming less effective, and she looks at the success rate of the movements in achieving their aims in order to come to that conclusion. And there's quite some complexity as well, and definitely some things we can bring out in the discussion around how potentially the digital age is making movements more or less effective. So moving on now to common sense. Oh, sorry, let me go through some other questions as well that came out of this. What I've just talked about here, limitations and success of social media, violence and non-violence, which I've mentioned, perhaps the fetishization of what we see as non-physical violence, but perhaps a question to ask you, for example, Insulate Britain would say that they are a non-violent group. They are a climate activist group in the UK, but they have been occupying our motorways. And a lot of people have been saying that as quite a violent act because it has a high chance of causing death. But as I say, I think there's far more within violence we could talk about. So moving on to common sense for the 21st century. So as I said, this was kind of an analysis of the ideas behind Extinction Rebellion. So the premise of this is that we need to accept the truth, which is that we're headed for extinction. And therefore, the gradualist approach is completely not possible. We have to have revolution because the alternative is extinction and is genocide. So their aim is really radical. I don't think I realized quite how radical it was until I read this, which is the government needs to hand power over to the National Citizens Assembly to decide how to act on the crisis. The status quo needs to be replaced, and the economy must fundamentally change to move away from exploitation and growth to sustainability. So as they're quite famous for Extinction Rebellion, in which they're, you know, quite broad, I think also in Europe. I'm not sure much about outside, and perhaps our other participants can let us know, but they really go off the premise of civil disobedience, which is not about an inconvenience as they're normally seen in Britain, but about demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice something, yourself, your, you know, normality perhaps, for the common good. And it's also to get people on board with joining the movement, to provoke a national conversation and debate. So we need to use a neutral language, Roger Hallam says, in order to really gain people, to get people on board and to build a mass movement. And what's also key to this is that we don't just replace the government, we really replace much more than that. We need to engage people on a spiritual level, we need to engage them on a cultural level, and we use different methods to do that through art, design, music. It needs to be human and fun. And building alliances is key. So small businesses, political groups, media, education and culture institutions. So some of those institutions that were mentioned by Erica, but definitely not all of them, with some significant emissions, which I think we should talk about. And finally, I just wanted to give an example on this side of one of the ways that they would use civil disobedience in order to get the aim of replacing the government, which is, say, for example, calling on councils to give central government an ultimatum. If government doesn't act, these people could do something like go on hunger strike, and people could refuse to pay their taxes. So I had quite a lot of controversial questions on this. He's missed out some of the key pillars of support, which in a historical analysis done by Erica Chenoweth, she would say perhaps he hasn't gotten everyone involved, including what are enormous businesses meant to do, and how are they meant to transition or be a part of XR, which leads on to this second bubble here. I mean, it talks about a movement which is inclusive, but I don't know many councillors who'd be willing to go on hunger strike for the climate movement. How inclusive is a movement such as this? And is this really neutral language? XR has radical aims and tends to have quite a white middle class following. Do people really understand what it's all about, and do they really support this, and what's in it for them? And perhaps the most controversial of all, I noted in some of the solutions that the fantastic cheat sheet put together, carbon taxes and taxes on virgin materials to encourage recycling. These are things that we are already doing, and which some people might say are quite neoliberal market solutions. And a little caveat to this, if we want to remove the government, how effectively can we collect these taxes that XR want? So a lot for us to come back to when we reflect on this. So not to rush us on, but to make sure that I stop talking soon, I'm going to come on to the final book, which is rather different to the other two. but I think will provide some really interesting connections. So full disclosure, apologies for, I made a mistake in the notes. I meant Hochschild and I was saying Hallam, but I was talking about this book, which is a history of the abolition of the slave trade, with a particular focus on the abolitionists. I'd really highly recommend this. They had it in my library because it's not a really recent book. It was produced a few years ago, and its richness is in the narrative detail. You really get a sense, more than I ever have from anything else, of the lived experience of slaves and of the psyche and of the mentality and the context within which people were slave traders, and how the slave trade was understood at the time. So I really recommend this book. Sorry, that was my timer. I will hurry up. So it's about the abolition of the slave trade, which happened in 1807, and of slavery itself in 1832. And a caveat to this, it happened, but just to bear in mind how controversial this was at the time, they gave away roughly 40% of the national budget in government bonds to slave owners as compensation. So I think perhaps a question for us to take forwards is, how easily can we do cross comparisons across history about social movements and equality, when definitely the abolition of the slave trade perhaps is not quite the rose-tinted view that we should have on it. Read the book to find out more. So at the beginning, basically Hochschild outlines the situation. At the end of the 18th century, more than 2/3 of people were in some kind of slavery. And the whole book focuses in largely on the people who were instrumental in bringing about the end of the slave trade, and the end of slavery itself. But there's also a huge amount of circumstance that leads to this happening: the French Revolution, the slave revolt in Haiti, which was called Saint-Domingue, and the American Civil War, which were really crucial to bringing them about. But the success of the movement was based on some quite extraordinary individuals. Equiano Oluda, who was a slave, an ex-slave, and his writings were really influential in this. And Granville Sharp, who he doesn't really explain their motivation, but there is a huge amount of religion that led to the abolition of the slave trade, and that came from the Quakers. So not only was their desire to end the slave trade based on the idea, and again, I'm going to say this isn't about equality. This was about it was still patronizing, and it was still saying Africans are like children, as they said in those days, and that we just want to treat them slightly less badly. So I would definitely, if anyone it portrays, this period as going for equality, it definitely wasn't. The Quakers themselves had a history of acting as a pressure group, because they were outside as a religious sect that was outside the norm, and their methods were instrumental, basically bringing petitions to government, garnering public support, negotiating about taxes, was hugely influential. Having a conservative politician, Wilberforce, in Parliament, he's got a big name, actually had very conservative views on everything, including women's rights. But him bringing bills to the fore was crucial. And they also had a prominent lawyer on their side who he basically got through an act which seemed rather non-controversial until people realized it actually had abolished 2/3 of the slave trade. Again, I won't delve into too much detail now, but also quite a turning point. I think this brings up a question I've already mentioned, which is around how much can we do cross comparisons across history. I think, as I say, I find it rather dangerous when people do it to the slave trade sometimes, because they say the abolitionists were not fighting for what we might think that they were. They were moved by a religious motivation, which is quite different to perhaps the religious motivations that exist today. And a lot of what happened was changed because of history and actions of others rather than actions of the abolitionists themselves. I think is something that we could potentially take forwards for our discussion. So I'm going to stop there and hope that that was all clear.
Yeah, thanks, Chloe. That was great and really comprehensive. I'm wondering if just for the recording, it might be valuable if you just keep screen sharing so that anyone watching that can see what we're talking about in the discussion a little bit.
Absolutely.
I mean, you've got loads of questions on the actual mural. So I wonder if we should, if anybody would particularly like to comment on one of those questions that came up. There were loads of really good thoughts.
It was quite an overwhelming one. We could pick a book as well, if people wanted to delve in. I don't know how much people focused in on different books or just had a quick look at them before the session.
Yeah, if you have read a book, why don't you just write that in the chat, or if you haven't, and there's absolutely no shame in if you haven't, don't worry, then maybe just throw that in as well. And Loic, do you want to kick off? You're still on mute.
I do this every time. So
has COVID taught you nothing, Loic?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, thanks for the summary. That was great. I think I got a sense of what the other two books were about. I read, the one I did read was Common Sense for the 21st Century. So I suppose, although there's some interesting stuff in Bury the Chains that has kind of like got me sort of asking more questions. And I think there's stuff that Akala talked about in Natives that is maybe relevant to that. I think I'll focus on the book that I did read, which is Common Sense for the 21st Century. And I think there was 2 points that you had, one about the inclusivity and the use of neutral language, and that the book itself is actually quite sort of hardcore in the way it says, you know, governments are committing genocide and we need to overthrow the government. And that's, so one of the principles of Extinction Rebellion, so I'm not part of Extinction Rebellion, I think I learned a lot about it through reading this book, is this kind of telling the truth is a radical act in itself. So that's why they use language that's strong. But when I got further into the book, he starts actually tempering a lot of that with the call for National Citizens Assembly, and this idea of inclusivity is that the National Citizens Assembly would be pulled from people from all walks of life and all different parts of the country. And they also talk about that the Extinction Rebellion should be decentralized. And if you have, say, a working class community, it should be organized by that community for that community. And in the same way that if you have like an immigrant community in a city somewhere, they should also self-organize. And then the discussions that happen within that Extinction Rebellion's kind of micro group will then be relevant to the experiences of the people within that group. So it's like this idea of kind of decentralization with the overall movement conforming to these kind of central ideas. So the idea is that Extinction Rebellion isn't centralized, and that decentralization means that you can have this inclusivity. But then the difficulty is, and this is something he talks about in the book, is that kind of eco-activism has always been something that the white middle class do in Britain. And he acknowledges that it's really difficult to kind of break out of that mold. So one of the things that the book is talking about is trying to break that mold. But I don't know if, I mean, I suppose we'll see how effective that becomes, because everything that I've seen in the news, at least, and in media for Extinction Rebellion has, I think, also been dominated by a particular kind of old school of activists. But I think there is definitely, from the people I know in Extinction Rebellion, there is a very concerted effort, which I think is making progress to try and include other people from other walks of life. So I think he does acknowledge it in the book, but I'm not sure if that's a problem that's been solved yet. I suppose then quickly on the other thing, the suggested measures at the end of the book, he says himself that these are like ideas, but they could be tossed out of hand. And the idea would be to get the National Citizens Assembly to actually decide on the route forward. And he also mentions the recent referendums in Ireland, this is how it was done for the abortion referendum and the referendum on gay marriage, and this was very interesting for me being Irish, seeing the contrast between the conversations there and the conversations here around the Scottish independence referendum and the conversations around the Brexit referendum, here it was hugely politicized and very, very divisive. In Ireland, while there were very, very divisive and difficult issues, they weren't politicized in the same way, because it was kind of the people deciding the wording and the conversation around the referendums. So the result was kind of a national conversation that seemed to be a lot more kind of honest and less extreme, and a lot less sort of misinformation around it. It seemed to be a much calmer discussion. Now, Ireland is a much smaller country, and we are not nearly as dominated by the Murdoch press and all the rest of it. So there's other issues there. But I think he was really talking about this idea that we don't really know what shape the transition would take, and that would be the purpose of a National Citizens Assembly, and that it may be that we keep the Commons and the Lords and everything else and the Queen in order to facilitate that transition, because too hard a change could just devolve into chaos. So yeah, the kind of the headlines of the book were really extreme, but then the deeper message was a little bit more nuanced, while still calling for this radical movement. And he does talk about it as a rebellion, and a rebellion is necessary. But yeah, I think I'd be rambling on long enough now, so I'll stop.
No, that was super interesting. I think, as I say, like, I was taking those from your great notes and couldn't see those nuances, and that definitely does help to build a broader picture. But do you still, I think what really struck me was you know, the whole idea of councillors going on hunger strike to I just guess, I think for me, the inclusivity issue comes around the fact that you know, even with the level of disruption and you know, pretty much climate skepticism, other than one of our lords still been quite vocal about it, is going slightly under the carpet. But just this whole idea of like of everyone needing, which is what he's suggesting, everyone needing to have this same like emergency kind of feel, like urgency around this, and like be willing to go on hunger strike, the same like burning passion. I think that was for me where I was like, that to me is not inclusive, because you know, amongst my friends I could count on less than one hand the people who really care, and even then would I be willing to go on hunger strike and cut off financial support from the government when the government have already cut off so much of their financial support and probably wouldn't care, you know, it's such a centralized government. So yeah, I think did you feel like he had an answer to that?
Yeah, I did. So he was saying that I think that was a very extreme case as well. He did say that he didn't think it would take a lot to actually bring about radical change. He thought, you know, 200,000 people like camping out in front of the Houses of Parliament for 5 days might even be enough. So he was talking about like 1% of the population, not even that 3.5% threshold. And he was also talking about encouraging first-time activism. So keeping it really, really simple and moving away from the old school eco-activism of like gluing yourself to roads and stuff like that. And being like, the simplest thing is just get people out on the street for a march on one afternoon, just to kind of like, you know, break the seal, ease them in, and really encouraging this idea for the general population that you can do this. And he cited some like kind of peaceful rebellions in the past, where the first day, you know, 5,000 people came out, and the second day 12,000 people came out, and then the police tried to crack down on the third day when 15,000 people came out, and the police crackdown was what led to, you know, 30,000 people coming out the following day, and it kind of just this momentum built. So this idea of normalizing simple acts of civil disobedience and not going to those extremes. So the idea is that the people who do go to those extremes, this idea of kind of like this glorious sacrifice, where you have like a hardcore cell that will inspire a broader conversation and move the Overton window. So I really like this idea of the Overton window, which is the idea of what's acceptable in public discourse. And a lot of people say that Brexit and the Trump presidency have shifted that Overton window so far to the right, because Trump would say something ridiculous like, I'm going to, you know, abolish like elections, and I'll you know, stay elected forever, and I'm going to run for 3 terms, which is illegal and is what a dictator would say. But by him saying that and not acting on it, it kind of normalizes the idea that it's okay to talk about rigged elections and talk about gerrymandering, and in the UK around Brexit has normalized this idea of like talking about more extreme situations of immigration control. So this, on the other side, the hunger strike is like pulling it back the other direction.
Yeah, and I would say Extinction Rebellion has been really, really successful in the, because I remember challenging its target of Britain being net zero by 2025, and everybody kind of ridiculing it. But the power was in its radicalism, because it meant that a totally conservative government could make a 2050 net zero commitment, and that was perceived to be totally in line with its politics. Whereas if Extinction Rebellion had suggested a much later date, then it might not have seemed so aligned with the conservative politics. Esther, you've been nodding your head vigorously. Do you want to, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I can add my thoughts. I didn't sleep very well last night, so that's probably why I'm not so present. But yeah, I think so I was with Extinction Rebellion for their, I think it was in 2019, the October Rebellion. So I was down in London and I was organizing with them, and I learned a heck of a lot when I was there about what social movements are trying to do, and what they're supposed to do. And I think when I was there, I can't speak for everybody, but I think I want to talk to this thing around, like, say these really kind of like radical demands, and it's seeking like transformative change, whereas like a lot of folks I don't know, who work in social justice might be looking for incremental changes, like policy changes or changes at the local level, which are also important. But yeah, like Loic was talking about, the objective is to completely reframe the discussion, and also it's a real show of power as well to demand something like that. And a big part of creating change as well is getting people to become like politically active, which is how movements actually build power, is by they're basically ways for people to express themselves, people to express their like political views, because like the only other ways that we do that are through voting once every 4 years about stuff that we don't even know about. So like that's pretty much how much we're actually consulted on decisions that this country makes. So yeah, it's a different way of people expressing their voices, and it's a way of bringing the people's voices to like the table. So to demand something like that, it also kind of creates this broad umbrella of loads of people can kind of plug into it, and loads of people are excited by it, and in a certain moment people believe that change is possible, and people feel that they're politically powerful, and that makes like a really deep change in society, I think. And then the only other things as well is that after reading like these books and a few others about like other movements, it's you can see that they definitely share a lot of like similarities. There are just some common threads through all of them. And then at the same time, depending on like your geography, depending on your targets, depending on like the communities that you're relying on, or the structures that you're working in, like movements look really different. So like the ones that Erica Chenoweth is talking about, like they're a lot of them are trying to oust like dictators or like colonial regimes or something like that. So you need a very like that movement's going to look very different to one in the UK that's focused on climate action, in liberal democracy. Like that's going to look very different to, and say the one like Bury the Chains was kind of like a transnational movement, and you're also trying to integrate like another group of people into society. So there's a different kind between different communities and the amount of power the different communities have. Whereas like if you're trying to oust a dictator, it's like, you know, you're trying to disintegrate a certain structure, so you need like a very different movement. So yeah, I think that's something that like it took me a little while to understand, because I thought like some of these lessons could just be applied like really broadly to everything. So like at Animal Think Tank, we've been thinking about how can we apply these lessons to like animal justice. And it's really difficult because there's so much wisdom that you can learn from these past movements, but ultimately like it takes testing and experimentation, which Roger talks about in his book, which I think is really important to understand how these sort of things apply to whatever issue that you're like working on. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting. One thing that's coming to mind in light of that is the difference with, say, the suffragette movement, where they had this single votes for women demand, and the challenge which I think so Erica Chenoweth emphasizes how movements which have a single demand tend to be more successful, I think. And with climate, how can we utilize that, despite the fact that there is no silver bullet? But then in the same way with the votes for women, you know, that wasn't a silver bullet to gender equality. It was kind of the starting point. But I'm not sure that the climate movement quite has that single super clear demand. And I wonder what the consequences of that are. Is there anyone who hasn't spoken yet who would like to chip in? No? Esther, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, I just thought I'd comment on that, like around like the suffragettes and the climate movement. So I guess with like minority-led movements, like they tend to like demand like voting rights or like civil rights or representation in society. And those are the mechanisms in which like one like othered group can integrate into like a given society, because they're represented in like formal politics. So yeah, like in that sense, it's a completely different problem to what the climate movement is facing, because like the opponents are kind of like massive transnational like corporations, right? And if you think about that power structurally, it's so hard to like even fathom or you know like even understand. And you know it's a global problem, which is really interesting, because say like with the suffragettes, I mean obviously like women all across the world have suffered, but with the suffragettes it was a particular, you know, it's a particular issue in a particular nation. So yeah, like I just feel like the context of different movements like really matter in terms of like thinking about them.
Yeah, really struck me as well, Esther, when I was thinking about the just like reading that definition from Erica, as Anna's touched on as well, and just talking about the need to identify the same, like the oppressor, and to identify like a unified goal. But I think what I find like it's not even like the multinational corporations, it's that, you know, this environmental movement who's like, it's capitalism that's the fundamental problem, and then you have so much of the climate movement as well. I mean, we just had a whole COP where people are really not willing at all. It's the status quo, right? And it's therefore it's like, what is it? I mean, and then you kind of look at the environmental movement, and is it a little bit depressing, because there is nowhere near a unified, because it, you know, a lot of people as well, like degrowth and a lot of movements in the global south, and saying it's a different worldview that we need, and that's actually a fundamental part of this as well. And then I think this for me really came down to like, what is the environmental movement? Like there are people like XR who use civil disobedience. How different is that to a social movement? Could we call like the environmental movement a social movement? And I think that is something that definitely haven't I haven't really thought enough about.
Nisreen, did you have your hand up?
Yes, but then Esther mentioned a lot of things that I wanted to mention earlier, but I just wanted to say that actually there is a lot of people who have specific demands within the climate movement. Unfortunately, they have lower voice than the people who doesn't have specific demands. And this brings us to a very important topic, is the media support for the civil movement itself. A lot can be done with media, and a lot cannot be done without media, unfortunately. And I mean, just to give a small example to this, now a lot. I mean, I've got invited to hundreds of interviews, and instead of asking me substantive questions that it's related to my work, they always ask me about reflections on Greta's speech, for example. And I understand that it's important to have reflection on a public figure like Greta at this time, but unfortunately this takes away a lot of time. That way we can actually consider and think more about substantive changes and issues that we need to solve. So there is actually specific demands within the climate change movement. Unfortunately, it's not high enough, it's not heard enough. And also the role of media, which is also something we noticed in many of the civil movements around the world, where media is not there, it's not big enough, even if it's huge. And when media is there, it's big, even when it's not.
It's such a good point. It's like, how does everything reach us? Like, what platform is it, do people have in order to make those demands with something that's so widespread? We didn't lose Nisreen there? I'm sorry, I'm on a smaller view. No, so okay, cool.
No, I'm here.
Excellent. I think, did Luik have his hand up?
Yeah, just off the back of what Nisreen said, I think the idea that, for me, the fundamental idea behind any climate movement and the wider conversation around it is to stop breaking things. And I think it's a really, really simple idea. But I also think that there's been a huge amount of work done by very, very wealthy oil and gas companies over decades to do the same as what the tobacco industry did, and just sow this idea of uncertainty and dissent. And I saw an article a couple of weeks back that said in the year 2000, they polled the general public and everybody agreed climate change was an important issue, and everybody kind of broadly agreed, renewable energy is the way to go. And they conducted the same poll in like 2018 or something, and everybody wasn't sure if it was a real issue, and people weren't really sure about the outcomes. So I think there's been a deliberate misinformation campaign to make people uncertain and to make people think it's a really wishy-washy idea. And I think what Nisreen was saying about like the media is kind of complicit in this. And actually, when you think about it, it's a very, very obvious. The solutions are kind of painfully obvious, and we've known for decades what the solutions are. But I think a lot of the time, the way it's presented is kind of bogged down in details, like about but what can we possibly do about all the recycling? And it's kind of missing the broader picture of we should just stop making plastic. Yeah, I suppose. Oh.
I think I've got two reflections on that. One was, so I got quite involved with Extinction Rebellion last summer and became quite upset when Extinction Rebellion, some of the rebels blocked Rupert Murdoch's press very effectively, including a couple of friends. And naturally, the media response was horrendous and called Extinction Rebellion, an attack on the free press. And I thought, I kind of went into this crisis of, am I part of something which is actually damaging? It's actually not helping the movement because Extinction Rebellion now has a lower approval rating than it did previously. But I think what I then reflected, or people kind of helped me understand, was actually Extinction Rebellion at that point in time is not trying to be popular, it's trying to cause disruption to raise awareness of a cause. And it has actually done that incredibly effectively. And you saw that from like the Sun's response, where they basically put David Attenborough on the front page and said, obviously climate change is important. We just don't believe in Extinction Rebellion, but they were not saying that a few years ago, and that actually demonstrates how social movements, even if they're not popular, can actually drive really incredible social change. But it's then quite interesting thinking, okay, so Extinction Rebellion's tactics are actually really quite different to the school strikers' tactics, and that nobody, from my understanding at least yet, is being critical of the youth movement in the same way that the Extinction Rebellion has been subject to very heavy criticism, which is quite interesting. I wonder if that's partly because of the youth, because of their protest rather than disruption tactics. I'm not sure.
I think there's been a lot of pushback against the youth movement, and I've seen a lot of really, really nasty things said about Greta Thunberg. And like I was on the march in Glasgow on the 6th of November, and there was a guy on the side of the street with a placard that was like just abusive towards Greta Thunberg specifically, and on the other side said, you know, climate change isn't real, change my mind. So I mean, that might just be like a small pocket of internet nastiness, but I think there has been a lot of people like targeting, saying these are just silly children, they don't know what they're talking about. I don't think it's as, I think it's a bit subtler than what's coming out against Extinction Rebellion, but I think it's still there. I think also the general public is less likely to believe the criticism, maybe, because children are a little less of an obvious target.
Yeah, but it also demonstrates that there is real problems with the current situation of the youth movements. And I am saying this because I know people from from Sweden, but not from Stockholm, who actually have problems with Greta's push in Sweden, because, for example, one of my friends comes from the Arctic and they don't have like a real railways. So what can take actually 4 hours with a proper railway takes 14 hours because they don't have enough infrastructure, for example. And pushing for no flights in Sweden, for example, is really hard for them. And I can give hundreds of other examples of inequalities within countries in Europe itself and within the European continent. For example, also my colleague Vlad from Moldova, he's always been treated as a white man, European person, but where he comes from, Moldova, is really not the typical European situation. And I guess most of Eastern Europe is also suffering from infrastructure and so on. But I guess also considering different inequalities is something needs a higher I'm not necessarily saying knowledge, but a higher experience, where you can actually see these differences and live it somehow, even if not physical, and then you can adopt them and talk about them differently. So yeah, I can understand why a lot of people say that they're just city kids and they don't know what's happening, because even in Glasgow, the transportation system was by far worse, let me say, than London here. And I mean, the infrastructure was, comparing to many UK cities or areas, is less also. So the inequalities existed, and not taking these inequalities into account is really making problems within the movement itself. My final comment on this is, now we have Fridays for Future even in Global South, which is also a problem, because school striking is, not only for me, but for logic point of view, is and should be a North and Western way of putting things, because most of the Global South countries have problems in access to education in the first place, and it doesn't make any sense to ask the minority who have access to education to strike from school. Secondly, striking from school or marching is to push the governments to have lower emissions, more green policies, and so on, while most of the global south countries doesn't have these emissions in the first place and cannot actually adopt more greener policies because their economy is suffering anyway. So inequalities in different big movements like climate change is very important to take into account.
Absolutely. I think what you say as well about seeing that more reflected, maybe I haven't watched the kind of latest of Greta, but in the youth climate movement and just making sure that is always front and center, because these struggles are unbelievably, and they are the same struggle at the end of the day. Shall we? I might stop sharing my screen now even. And maybe we could go into the questions, because that was lovely to get like a bit of background on what you were up to in Glasgow, which hopefully is going to come out of our chat now. But yeah, I had a little call with Nisreen last week and thought about maybe just some questions to really get to know you better. It was really nice to hear you introduce yourself, but just for a little bit more background on Nisreen, just to blow your trumpet, because I don't think you will. Nisreen became an activist back in 2012. She's a Sudanese youth climate activist, negotiator, and democracy activist. To her name, she's got a bachelor's degree in physics, a master's degree in renewable energy. As she's already said, she's chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, was a co-organizer of the 2019 Youth Climate Summit, has written several policy papers on climate change, renewable energy, gender and youth inequality, and is currently, she also said at the beginning, chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. Just a reminder for everyone, in case you have specific questions relating to these, to ask Nisreen later on, and there will be plenty of time for you to ask questions. So the first thing that it would be really great, as I think someone just popped in the chat, to later on perhaps to hear a bit more of an overlap with the books, but I think just to give the audience more a sense of who you are, Nisreen. I mean, there's such an interconnection between being a democracy activist and a climate activist, and could you explain how these are interconnected for you and how it kind of happened? Oh, I think you're on mute.
It must happen. You must talk when you are in mute, otherwise it will not count.
I completely agree.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, the fight for democracy and the fight for climate change are both justice fights. When we talk about, there's two ways of putting things. One, when it comes to governance level, institutional level, and how climate change can be solved or actually mitigated within the country level. You need 5 or 4 main pillars to have a good climate change governance in the country, and one of them is political will. The second thing is to have strong institutes. The fourth thing is to have laws and regulations and policies. And the fourth thing is to have a strong stakeholder engagement. And we cannot have all of these 4 if we don't have a country that is actually not only democratic, but there's a rule of law, there is a respect for different rights. Because for me, climate change, environment, and rest of the services are basic human rights, are not just services that the government provide to the people. The second part, it's related to the fight itself, or the battle against climate change and against dictatorship itself. So as I said earlier, both of them are fights for justice. And if we did not really manage to find justice in any other ways, then I will give you a small example. If we manage to find climate justice, for example, but we did not find social justice within our countries, so how can we implement the climate justice winning into the country level? And the opposite, if we have a very good government, a very good democratic system, a very good, nice, and homogeneous civil society, for example, that works with the government in a very homogeneous way, but we don't have climate justice, then it will be impacted negatively on this social justice that the different countries are having, which is the case in many places right now, not in Sudan, unfortunately, but many places who have a very good structured government, but they are suffering so much from climate change and they don't have climate justice. For us, we don't have neither climate justice nor social justice. So it's very much related to each other, and it's actually similar to each other, because the fights for justice are typically the same as person who did both. I can tell you the only difference is what kind of flag or what kind of banner we are holding and what's written inside of it, but it's the same steps and the same downs and ups also.
Thank you so much. I think that was the most articulate connection and just summary of the interconnection between what some people see as separate movements, but as you said, you know, are the same that I've ever heard. So thank you so much. I was wondering whether you could explain a bit more about the Sudanese concept of nafir, and whether this constitutes a broader philosophy in how you think action to prevent climate change should be taken. And this also kind of thinking about, as they say, is the oppressor, do we need a different worldview? Is nafir something that could help us with that? Or is there too much of a danger that this could be co-opted? It would be really great to hear what you think, and maybe relating it to what's been going on in Sudan recently.
Yeah, so nafir is a pure Sudanese concept, and it's there for a while. And nafir means hurry up somehow. And we normally have it if we have any kind of crisis or need, even if someone died. In the Sudanese old context, when someone dies, we don't allow the family of the past person to cook in their house for at least 40 days. So the whole neighborhood agrees to every day one house of the neighborhood cooks food until the 40 days complete. If there is a flood, for example, if there is someone sick and they need to, for example, blood donation, if any kind of need happened, then they say that we have an nafir, and it means that everyone should hurry up to solve the problem. The concept of nafir became related to climate change, where we started to have more climate crises in Sudan, and where people actually wanted to help the less impacted, or the non-impacted people at all wanted to help the most impacted. And I can tell you how obvious climate change in Sudan is. Normally we have a flood every 15 or 10 years, and they mark people's life with it. So they say X was born in the year of the flood, Y was born in the year of the flood, for example. And that's because it was like a very long time. It's even more than 10 to 15. I think it's 15 to 20. The last big flood we had in Sudan was in 1988. But since 2013, we started to have severe floods. So from 88 until 13, I think this is almost a 30 year of like the cycle of the flood was like this. But since 2013, we started to almost have a flood every year. And we almost had nafir every year also for the flood. It became even more popular when in 2013, young people, because normally nafir is an old people thing, but young people did a very big movement to help the impacted people by the flood in 2013, and they called it Nafir, the same name. And the movement is there until now. In 2020, we also had one of the worst floods in 100 years, and Nafir was also there. So the idea is not, we did not change anything, it's the same way. The only thing that changed what we are using Nafir for and who's doing the Nafir normally. But I think it's the same spirit and idea of solidarity that the whole world is sharing right now. The percentage of this is different, of course. I mean, everyone's reactions to crises around the world, different kind of crises, not only climate change, are different, but there is some sort of solidarity for that.
Thank you. And do you see Nafir going more broadly within kind of like either Sudanese politics, or do you think it's something that could extend outwards, or would that be more a risk of it being co-opted and losing its real meaning?
Yeah, I mean, politics, no, but the concept itself, I mean, normally because we used to work we used to work within the previous regime government, which was a dictatorship government. We couldn't really have any connections with the governments, but since 2020, in the fall of 2020, because we had the transitional government that came after the revolution in Sudan, we would manage for the first time as Nafir to work actually with the government, and it helped us a lot, because I mean the governments have by far more resources than just the people, access to cars, access to data, access to offices in different places, and so on. Yeah, so they work with the government because there is a need for more collaborative work, but it cannot be a politician's exercise. It will lose its meaning in the first place.
Thank you. That's nice to hear. You feel there are quite kind of clear boundaries about it, and yeah, just to get more of a sense of how this philosophy has been working in Sudan. Thank you. In a video which I would highly recommend that others watch, which is Nisreen at COP, it's just a few minutes, and she gets introduced by Boris Johnson, which is, there we go. But at COP, you said that you have no doubt that the climate movement and Sudanese democracy movement will succeed in this particular video. Many people feel differently about the outcomes of both of these movements. So I was wondering whether you could explain how you're so optimistic.
Yeah, so it's not an optimistic view. It's more of a fact projecting the current situation. So the determination that both movements have, like whether it's climate change movement or the democratic movement in Sudan, is really essential, because I'm not sure how much videos you are seeing about the current situation in Sudan, but I always see videos that makes me feel like, I mean, we are going to succeed no matter what. And I had this feeling actually in February 2019 in one of the demonstrations, and the previous regime was so aggressive in that demonstration, but I couldn't believe my eyes when I started to hear gunshots, like, and I saw people running towards the gunshots, not from the gunshots, and I was like, oh my God, I mean, this generation cannot be defeated by a bunch of military people, because they have a very big determination to do it. Of course, I had to sit and talk to them after that and say, guys, this is suicidal. You should not do this, because we need you. If you die, then we lose someone that we actually need in the other fight of building the country after having our government and so on. But I mean, having these feelings in the first place of running towards the gunshot, not from the gunshot, was really shocking to me. And until now, I mean, today, like a few hours ago, I was seeing a video where five young men were playing football with tear gas. It was flaming. gas and they were playing football with it. So this one then shoot it to the other one, and the other one would like flip it and then shoot it to the other one, and so on. And it was so surreal video. I mean, watching people playing football with tear gas on fire is really easily, yeah, I mean, it can show you how much determined these people are. One other video also I've shared on my Facebook page. One, I think he's 13, I think. So he was in the demonstration and they were shooting sharp, but he was lucky that the shot got him in the right side, not the left side. So the shot actually entered from his back because he's so thin, and went out from his chest, the other side. And he was holding like this and screaming, we will do it whenever what, and then walking with the shot in his hand and his shoulder, holding his shoulder like this. And he was only 13, and his friend is also at the same age, because they look the same. They were so short comparing to the rest of the people. Was holding him and saying, don't worry, we will make it, you will make it, don't worry. And until they found people, and people kept asking him about his name and a number to contact his family, and then a car came and took him to the hospital, and luckily he's fine now. He only needed a lot of stitches back and forth, but he's so fine, and he's so actually happy that more than 23,000 saw the video, because he thinks that he at least did a small thing that he never counted, and he survived. He's not dead, but it's sending a very strong message of how the civil movement in Sudan is really determined to actually do it this time. And the climate change movement is also, a lot of people are determined to do it. The only thing is, a lot of people, a lot of interest, and a lot of manipulating things also. Until now, the Sudanese movement is so pure, and the climate change movement was also pure until a certain point. But I mean, the influence from inside of these movements can be more destroying than the influence from the outside, because we know our enemies, that this is an enemy, so we know the enemy. The problem is when you think somebody or some people or some companies or some institutes or wherever are an allies for you, and you deal with them like that, and then you discover that they're not allies. And when it comes to the climate change movement, as you mentioned, I started 2012. At that time, barely no one was speaking about climate change. When I speak about climate change, they look at me like, what? We don't know this, we don't understand. But now the numbers are increasing heavily. A lot of people are joining, and a lot of people are understanding, and they have substantive understanding of the problem and how they can be part of the solution, actually. So these are very two good signs that the movement will continue and succeed at the end. Yeah, the only problem with the two movements is that we are in a fight with, we are in a race with time. We don't have a lot of time to waste in both movements. But normally, as mentioned in one of the books also, that peaceful movements take by far longer than violent movements. And it's true, but we don't have that time.
Thank you. My goodness, you mentioned so much that was interesting there. I think particularly what you said around sometimes the enemy kind of being within and really undermining these movements. And also it really sounds like the role of technology and so particularly the Sudanese movement. Is anyone getting some nasty feedback from my headphones?
No? A little bit. It's manageable, but a little bit.
Okay. I was trying to make it closer to me to speak, but I'll actually let go. Thank you. Gosh, there are so many follow-up questions. I will go through the questions that I outlined to you, but I think yeah, definitely for the discussion afterwards, you've given us so much to think about. You talk about in another video I watched with you speaking about world leaders needing to walk the talk. And particularly coming out of COP, having been there and seen the discussions, what to you would constitute walking the talk, and especially in relation to African countries?
Oh, that's a very big, hard question to answer. Well, I mean, what I just mentioned about allies and enemies and stuff is very much articulated in this COP, because this COP was not betrayed by Global North, nor Europe, nor US. It was more pushing from Saudi Arabia, India, and China, and of course Brazil from background. And it's very alarming that countries that we think our allies, we think that we're in the same boat together, start demanding things that we know it's so dangerous for all of us. I guess they have very much reasonable ways or reasonable issues regarding how things are being done at COPs and how this is impacting their countries, but they don't really look at the bigger picture of how this is impacting the global warming and the global climate situation. But walking the talk in general means that they should stop saying we can't do much. This is the most we can do, because they can't do much, and we know that. They will be hated by a lot of people, especially the lower working class, because most of them are working in a fossil-based jobs, which is of course a problem. So having replacements for this job is not going to be easy for the economy nor for the government, but it's not impossible. And taking hard decisions, doing the hard things instead of doing the easy things, is exactly what we want right now and what we need. And a lot of people are giving examples of the Yellow Vest movement in France after the taxation on the fossil fuel and stuff. And I said, because simply they didn't have a reasonable replacement. And that's why, I mean, everyone are thinking about their own stability. And I'm not here talking about using public transportation or using your own car only, or using a recyclable material of plastic. No, I'm talking about their own health insurance, their own living expenses, their own salaries, their own kids' schools, and it's a big supply chain relation together, related to each other. So we must have alternatives for everything before we actually say, because we know it's not easy. For the African continent, it's by far more complicated. We had 4 coups in Africa only in 2020, 2021, and this makes it very hard to actually talk about world leaders. I mean, who are the African leaders? Are they the military who did the coups, or the actual presidents who got elected, or it's the just government that is waiting there and cannot do anything? So walking the talk for the African continent is a very tricky question, because who should talk, who should walk what kind of talk? And I think also it's related to having strong institutes. I mean, AU, the African Union, comparing to the EU, is just a place to waste resources and pay a lot of big amount of money for people who doesn't actually do a lot of things. I'm not sure if what they are doing is not enough, or the need is bigger than their ability. But I'm sure that they're not doing enough when it comes to everything. But normally walking the talks means stop being the victim, because definitely they're not the victim, and start action, like doing real things, and maybe talking to people, saying that we are lifting the subsidies, we are taxating the fossil fuel, but instead of having a bus every 5 minutes, you will have a bus every 2 minutes, for example. But this means that you should pay more, because this is a public service. Public service doesn't come from the sky, it comes from the taxpayers, it comes from the public income. And of course, earlier you were talking about degrowth and other stuff, And I'm not 100% pro degrowth, but I'm sure it will be a necessary step in actually achieving carbon neutral. And I always ask people, do you prefer to live long, healthy, and simple life? I mean, simple but enough, not simple as needy life, but simple as enough. Or you prefer to die very fast and wealthy? I mean, you cannot take your money with you to the grave, you know. And the answer was always the long, simple but healthy life. And I think this is the solution, and this is why the degrowth is very important at some point. It shouldn't be forever, because I understand the need of humanity. It's something inside of humanity that we want to develop and grow more. But it's a very important stage to actually be able to reach the carbon neutrality in the world equally, and also have enough services and enough access to education, health, the basics in all of the world.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, you touched on why it's so special to have you with us and so important to have you with us, and that it just wasn't reflected enough at COP. I mean, the absolute catastrophe of the climate finance that's happened to actually, you know, make this happen, and just there needs to be a whole different imaginary of how this should happen for the African continent, right? Because what are you going to do, turn down really dirty industry when you really, you know, needing the jobs and those kind of questions that, and as you say, what world leaders in Africa, I think, you know, it's so important to hear your perspective and just connect those struggles and also just see how poorly they're being reflected and acted on at the moment. As you say, you know, the last people who should be putting themselves forward as the victims are the Western nations. But I mean, we've talked a lot about how interconnected it's climate justice. I mean, social movements, environmental movements being essentially the same thing. But I mean, in terms of the urgency of I mean, it was really interesting to hear you say how, you know, how urgent the Sudanese democracy movement is, which we tend to think of the climate movement as so time pressured because of these irreversible tipping points. Do you think that, I mean, it is completely unique, the environmental movement and the climate justice movement, or not? I mean, how much should we be premising therefore and that science above anything else, as you've kind of already touched on?
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of context about the situation, a lot of people saying, yeah, we had 27 years of COPs, but nothing happened. Well, we had more than 44 years of dictatorship. We always have a dictatorship, a revolution, then a transitional period, never ending the transitional period. Then we have another coup, and then the coup brings a dictatorship. Then we had a revolution. Then we have a transitional period that never ended, and then a coup, and then the coup brings a dictatorship, and so on. It continues every time. And yeah, and a lot of people claims that civil and violence movements reach their goal longer, but the results are more sustainable than the violence one. And I don't necessarily agree, because every time we had a violent coup in Sudan, it ended up staying there for, the minimum was 6 years, the maximum was 30 years, which is the last dictatorship we have. And we had to break this cycle, you know, of having revolution and transitional period, then coup, and then all over again. Otherwise, we would just be trapped in this, like rats running in a circle all of the time. And of course, this is something we don't want. But it's similar for climate change. We always have high hopes, bad COP, but then they say, well, we do it next COP. And then we go to the next COP with high hopes, then we get bad results, but they say, well, we still have a next year, we get it next year, and so on. And I hope that the COP battle doesn't take 44 years to be solved as the battle of the Sudanese movement. But I can tell you that the civil movement and violence movement is always something needed, but it's not always something appreciated. Because when people who understand and appreciate the peaceful movement are not the people that peaceful movement happens against, you know. Yeah, I am not sure exactly how to bring clearer picture for you, because I think I'm from the context itself, and when you are from the context itself, it's a bit easy to get yourself disattached, so we can deliver things neutrally, but I can tell you I'm not neutral at all. Yeah.
That's a really good answer. I think it just brings that whole question of what is this urgency, right? I mean, if the urgency within your life, you have no rights because of the democratic situation in your country, that is going to seem far more urgent, and is a lot more urgent than you know, what's going to be happening with the climate, even though, again, as you've already mentioned with Sudan and the appalling floods you've been happening, you know, are so interconnected. But yeah, thank you so much. It's so fantastic to have you with us and to have had your perspective on that, and to have brought some of the readings in so nicely as well. So I think now is a good time to open up to the audience, and you've given us so much to think about. Hopefully, I think there are a few of us enough that people could unmute and ask their questions. Would anyone like to go first? Always a bit scary.
Yeah, this isn't really a question, but I was hoping you could talk more about this. It was when it's when you and Chloe were kind of talking about how, like, sometimes like the demon can be like within us, and how, you know, because it's something that I feel like I've experienced a lot in movement spaces, which is like, you know, we kind of make ourselves feel powerless and make ourselves feel weak. And, you know, like a lot of the conversations are about like how bad the world is and how massive the powers are that we're against. And in a sense, yeah, obviously that's true, but sometimes I think it's coming from a deeper place of like a feeling of pain and inferiority and of being ignored. And I think like the role of like movements is to transform that in people, like that's part of cultural change. But those are my thoughts. But I was wondering what you were kind of like getting at, and if you could talk on.
Yeah, so there's two kinds of within us demons, as you mentioned. There is within us as movement, and there is within us as people, you know, as a human person, like standing solo person, not as collective movement. And as a person, it's very tricky to beat yourself. But it's possible. I know a lot of people who had problems with not only their self-esteem, but actually their ability to do things. And normally this becomes a problem only when a certain events happen in life, like bullying, if you got bullied when you were younger, if you had a rough childhood, and other stuff like this. But the one I'm concerned about more, and I think these battles, the fight against the dark part of yourself is something manageable, and it's happening everywhere. It's just you need a very good support system to go through it. But the one I was talking about earlier is the demons within the same allies, the same movement itself, and I can give you hundreds of examples. So, for example, in the Sudanese situation, there is always the old school of politicians, and there's the new schools of politicians, and then there is the activists who are not politicians, but they have a lot of influence on the political level. And there is, of course, the previous regime and the military services. Okay. So for a long time during our revolution in 2018, 2019, our direct enemy was the previous regime, which is the dictatorial regime, and the military at the same time. But then after the fall of the previous regime, we started to have problems, because we started to have a problem between the old school in politicians and the new school politicians and the activists who are not politicians. and these problems is mainly an interest problem. The old politicians school wants to keep their influence, wants to have the higher hand and stuff, so they are willing even to sacrifice the gains of the revolution itself, just in order to or to keep these powers, you know. And the new school politicians wants to prove themselves, even if this proof was against also the gains of the new revolution. And the activists who are influencing the political situation but not politicians have many problems also. First of all, they are not experienced, they don't have like experience in politics itself, so they're more of their experience is and were showing resistance, were showing rejection, but when it was the time to actually build the country, their abilities was by far less than expected or than they actually had, because they didn't have an experience in running a country. But also they had a problem with the old school politicians and the new school politicians, because also the previous regime managed to put a very solid idea that being a politician is a very bad thing, and unfortunately both new school politicians and old school politicians did not prove that they are wrong. So now we have anti-politicizing movement in Sudan, and it's so hard to build a democracy without having political parties and political movement in the country and so on. So it's a bit tricky. It's similarly tricky, unfortunately, in the climate movement, and that why? Because a lot of people now thinks climate movement is not really about climate change and really about saving life, but more about fame, about how many likes or followers they have on Twitter, about how many followers they have in the world, in physically, about how much their movement is getting funding, about how much newspapers and different media are speaking about them, and these are a real problem because it's not genuine. We are talking about people's life. We're talking about billions. It's not a simple number of people. And if you make this kind of a show, it's very bad, and it's very hard to reverse it, because sometimes when you are in a show, you say something that you're not sure of, and by saying that thing, because you have influence, you have access to media, you destroy a lot of others' work. So for example, a lot of people were working on green jobs and how fine green jobs, and then one small speech spoke about how green jobs are blah blah blah. It destroyed the whole struggle and the whole push for having green jobs. And green jobs is very important because people need jobs to live. I mean, not everyone will be supported by their families, or not everyone inherited a lot of numbers of monies from their families, so they have to have a green jobs. So sometimes you just want to be good to the case, but you end up doing bad things, and sometimes you just want to prefer your personal interest over the group interest, and sometimes you just fall into trap of media, fame, money. There's a lot of traps that people in different movements, especially like the Sudanese movement and the climate change movement, can fall into, because there's a lot of interest in them.
Thank you. What a brilliant answer to that. Does anyone have a follow-up question to that, or was there something else that they wanted to ask? Anna, do I see your hand?
Yeah. Thanks, Nisreen. I've had goosebumps on several occasions and feel like you've brought such an interesting lens, and it's been a real reminder for the book club of how important it is to get different voices from all over the world. So thank you very much for being so candid. I have two questions. One is, you mentioned earlier how you sometimes do interviews and don't get asked the questions that you want. So one is, is there like an elephant in the room that we've missed that you would really like to talk about? And then the second one is a slightly more personal question. So Samantha Power, I found quite inspiring in the past, and she's talked about the importance of being both a diplomat and an activist. And I'm currently a sustainability consultant, but have also been involved in activism, and I'm sometimes very aware of, if I'm too activist on LinkedIn, is that going to undermine the way that I'm perceived of by businesses? And how can how can you marry the two? And you are, you very much talk about yourself as being an activist and a negotiator. And I wonder if there have been certain tensions there, or how you navigate being both because it's something that as young people who are currently activists grow up and move into the world of work, if they decide that their primary thing is not going to be activism, how can they negotiate that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for this question. It's, I don't know what, I mean, which question to answer first, because both of them are very fact questions, and I like fact questions. But I will start with the last one. I've met Samantha in many occasions in Sudan, but also when she was recently assigned, because we had a discussion about climate change and how USAID can advance the climate change profile. And then again, we shared a panel at the US Pavilion at COP. So me and her, I mean, we shared a lot of discussions together, and I think she's absolutely right, and that's why I actually started negotiating, as you mentioned. And I actually had a quiet time to decide what to do and how to do it, because it was the interest of climate change was low at the time I began. And I began when I was a freshman at the university. So I had a lot of time actually to think how to navigate things. So I started doing climate change as an activist, but then I realized that the biggest changes doesn't happen here, it happens up. Here, there's a very important role to play, but in the higher level, there's a bigger influence. And I wanted to be part of this bigger Samantha Power. Easter, I saw your question. Samantha Power is the director of USAID. She was also one of the advisors for Obama administrations. Okay, so yeah, so there is I don't want to say like there's a big difference, but there's a big value of having enough time to actually decide what you want to do. And when I realized that there's a bigger influence when you are in the policy making level, I started to talk to some of the Sudanese negotiators, and they told me that it's a good thing to start negotiating. And I did my first negotiating when I was in my third year of university. I didn't even finish my bachelor degree. And now, after spending 5 years of negotiation, I can tell you that there is bigger influence up, but there is more need for influence down. I mean, by down, I mean in the community level, or the national level, or even the international level. And I find myself having the two hats, or wearing the two hats, is very useful, because as an activist, I can say things that member states cannot say because of diplomacy and because of different regulations in different countries. But being a negotiator, they know that when I speak, I don't speak from an empty mind, or I don't speak from not knowledgeable background, because I speak about articles, I speak about text, I speak about resolutions and things that I know and I followed, and I've been part of the making process of it itself. So, and adding the physics one, when I tell people that I'm a physicist, although I never practiced as a physicist after graduation because I was pushed into the climate change so much, but it changed their perspective a lot. They think that, oh, now this is someone we really need to listen to. And unfortunately, having all of these credibilities is necessarily needed when you are so young. No one asks a prof with white hair, for example, what did he do for master's or for bachelor degree, for example, because his age speaks for him. They think so. But when you are young and doing a lot of activism, you need to really prove yourself in different ways. But also, actually, what Samantha mentioned was my drive to start climate activism, and I can tell you how. I remember when US went into Iraq. I was only in my first year of primary school, but I keep hearing big words like Security Council, like UN. Kofi Annan was the General Assembly the Secretary General at that time. Nuclear power, international specters, and a lot of things that I could not really understand. But what was really confusing for me, why a country like US, which is so far away, have an interest in a country like Iraq, which is a small country in the MENA region. And I developed a secret passion for political science at that time, but I couldn't name things. I couldn't name it political science, I couldn't name it geopolitics, and I couldn't name it anything. But as growing in my primary school, I really fell in love with natural sciences. So I decided to do natural science in university, and that's why I chose physics. But then in my first year, and that's how also I managed to become a social activist or a democratic activist in Sudan. In my first year, we had a big problem in university because in the year before, South Sudan separated, and our fossil fuel based in economy collapsed because most of the oil wells were in South Sudan, not in Sudan. And we had a very aggressive steps from the government aggressive economically. So a lot of demonstration used to go out from our university, and as a result, they closed our university for 3 months when I was in my first year. So in these 3 months, I decided to do a research on how to link both things, political science and physics at the same time, which is natural science. And I discovered something called science diplomacy, which is using science in diplomacy. And the biggest 2 topics under science diplomacy were climate change and water. Because normally countries share water, they share rivers, they share lakes, especially if it's a big lake. They also share shores and stuff, and they need a lot of diplomacy in actually managing the situation. But I could relate more to physics and the current situation of Sudan to climate change, and that's how I knew about climate change in the first place. So for me, it's the egg first or the chicken. I'm not sure if you know this. I mean, the question of, did God create the chicken first or the egg? So I cannot really say was it the political activism or the democracy activism first or the climate change, because both developed at the same time. Your other question was about, sorry, I forgot it.
Oh, it was just, are there any questions that you haven't been asked, or are there any topics which you think we've missed that you would like to touch on?
Yeah, no, my earlier comment or note was really about me being asked to reflect on some people's speeches, and it's not fair because yeah, they given a speech, we might like it, we might not like it, but to have a full interview with someone else to ask him about his opinion or her opinion in other person's speeches, instead of asking him, like, or her, of course, direct questions related to their own their own interest or their own work or their own contribution is I think is not fair, and it was not the case in today's session, so don't worry.
Very glad to hear that. Caitlin, Catherine, shall I read your question out, or would you like to do it?
Oh yeah, I don't mind. I can also read it out. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi. No, really nice to meet you. It's so nice to have you here in the call. I was just wondering if we can talk a bit more about social media platforms and the role and effects they can have on us individually, but then also on society, and how we can align the values that are communicated via these channels with the values we need in the future. Because in the end, it's us who fuel these platforms, right? And I think they're really powerful, and I wanted to hear more about it.
Yeah, I mean, your question reminds me of, should policy change regarding companies and production, or should the customer's opinion about what to buy and what not to buy change? I simply say both. So yeah, us as users for social media should change our behaviors on using social media, but also the policies that social media is using should also change, because currently it's more destructive than it's constructive. And we can see a lot of cases of that. I mean, the TikTok videos that everyone is crazy doing, even if cost them their lives. The selfies, I mean, I remember there had a report about the dangerous selfies ever and how much people died because of dangerous selfies, but also how should we react on dangerous selfies, for example, in social media also count. But unfortunately, this a problem should be dealt in both ways. If you deal with it with one way, you cannot really solve the other part. For example, I have big opinions about what's happening in Palestine and how the Israelis is violence doing with the Palestinians, for example. This is just an example from my side, but I cannot write that in Facebook. And for me, for example, it will seem like lowering the voices of people who are pro the Palestinians, for example, but not necessarily against the Israelis. But from the Israeli, for example, point of view, they would think that it's more of protection to the public opinion and not having a tourist-sponsored situation. I can give you hundreds of examples of Islamophobia, for example, of a lot of things and a lot of issues that minor communities are suffering from climate change, from policies of the media, but also changing the policies of the media itself will not be enough, because it will stop both the positive and the negative parts of it, but also the how people are reacting to social media should also change. How to do the change of the policies is by far easier than to do the change of the people behaviors or the customers or the users of the social media. I mean, the social change is a very long and exhausting process, and you can not measure the impact very, very easy. For example, a lot of people now are talking about how bad bullying is, and a lot of channels are anti-bullying and stuff, but also a lot of videos are cheering for bulliers, and actually a lot of shares and a lot of followers following bully because they think it's funny or nice or necessarily or whatever. Yeah, so it's so hard to control it, but it's not impossible again, and we have to do it both ways: policies when it comes to the social media itself, and also how customers use social media.
Thank you so much. That was so lovely to look at both sides of that argument, which I think is definitely not spoken enough about. Does anyone have any more questions? In the chat, or feel free to unmute, or whether there was anything that tied the books back to what Nisreen was saying. Yeah, let me know. And was your hand up in the chat, Julia?
Yes, it was.
Julie, sorry. Go for it.
So mine is, I just wanted to hear from Nisreen's experience, how do they deal with situations in which you don't really get a sense of political will in addressing climate change, and you're there and you almost feel that you're not being heard? How do you handle that?
Yeah, if I understood your question correctly, when I'm negotiating, how do I feel, or do I know that there is not enough political will?
Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, they start bringing excuses, saying, well, we need to go to our head of delegation to approve this, for example. Or they say, but the language of the agreement did not say this. I mean, of course, the language of the agreement did not say this. That's why we are here negotiating. Otherwise, it will not be necessarily if it's there in the negotiation agreement. And the second step, they start wasting time by having long statements that doesn't relate really to the topic, and you cannot stop a party when they start to speak. they have to stop by themselves, even if they took half an hour from 1 hour session. So if one party or one country decided to speak half of the time of the session, you cannot really stop them. And another way, another tactic is where we actually agree on a text, and then in the final day, in the final sessions, they says that we cannot accept this text. And unfortunately, in the UNFCCC, it's built on consensus. So if not all parties agreed really on what they want to do, you cannot go forward, and you just find yourself wasted the 2 weeks of the discussions, because in the last day they said, no, we don't accept this. There's a lot of tactics to show you that there is no really political will. What makes me angry is wasting our time in the first place, and our resources and our health, both mental and physical health, by going, I mean, for this COP, we Sudan was a red list country until the last 2 weeks of October, so we were risking to come to UK and have 5 to 10 days of quarantine if you are not vaccinated, and wasting a lot of resources in tickets and accommodation, and staying in a very cold country compared to the country we are coming from. And then we risked having COVID at the end, because I mean UK have record of more than 5,000 cases daily, which is by far higher than the number in Sudan when we actually came here. And they still I mean, hinder the outcomes and gives you bullshit things, sorry for saying this, at the end of the COP. So it's really frustrating. I cannot say the opposite, but there's a lot of ways that you can know that there's no political will, but you unfortunately these ways you have to learn them by practice. The body language, the discussions between them as team, if they are teaming up, what they can do in the last minute is something you can never predict unless if you were there a few times, and then you can predict their movement and so on. It's just like playing poker. I have never played poker, but I saw it in movies where actually people manage to predict the cards after playing a lot of times.
Thank you, Nisreen. It's so great to think of you in the room, having, you know, as we've talked about today, such an important perspective, and then bringing that to what can be, yeah, a complete lack of political will, as that question just underlined. So I think it would be really nice to go around everyone really briefly, just to get a last reflection, what they're going to take away from the session for today. So I will start with Esther.
Yeah, I think I just found everything really interesting and enriching, and I think I also really appreciate that maybe I'm not looking hard enough, but I don't see a lot of spaces talking about things, you know, really having good conversations about movement building and how we could do that, and talking about these really important, you know, texts. So that's been really wonderful, and I really appreciate Nisreen for like offering all her wisdom and experience to us as well. So it's been really lovely. So thank you for putting it together.
Can you pass on to Catherine, and then after you've been Catherine, maybe you can pass on to someone else.
Oh yeah, first of all, really thankful for this session. I think it was really insightful. And what I'm taking away is that stories matter and words matter, because I think at the beginning we said it's actually really powerful what you say and what you share with others, because then it can change mindsets, it can make them think, it makes them reflect and ideally change. So I think that was really powerful, and yeah, I think that can hopefully trigger this social change and movement that we want to see. And then of course, as you said, also from top down, there needs something to happen. So ideally we can meet in the middle, right, from the top and from the down, and hopefully see changes soon. Yeah, that would be my reflection. Thank you so much once again.
Loic, let's go next.
Yeah, so yeah, I enjoyed Susan's discussions a lot, and one thing I will definitely take away, especially after hearing more about what you've been doing, Nisreen, is I found it great that your response to your time being wasted was you were angry because they were just wasting time. And I think that for me is the main takeaway, is that I think there's a lot of the time, and that for years now, I've been feeling completely powerless. And just that reminder that failure really isn't an option. That it's just there's no point in giving up, because that basically just means giving up on any future. So it's really nice to be reminded of that. So thanks. I'll pass on to Jane.
Hello. Sorry, I'm sorry. I've just been looking at my mugshot all night because my video's bust. I'm conscious that's been absolutely fantastic. I've been conscious I've been really quiet all the way through that. I think that's just because there's been so much to absorb. I've got sheets and sheets of paper all around me now, and trying to pick one thing out of that is I'm not going to do it. It's too hard. I've got loads to take away and learn more and think more about. It's definitely something there about what Esther was saying about movement building that I'm really interested in, and loads of what you were talking about around Nafir. Am I saying that right? Nafir, that concept. I thought that was really powerful. And loads more books to read. Yeah, so no, thank you so much. That's been absolutely amazing. And I will pass on to Anna.
Hi, yeah, I think I echo a lot of what everybody said, have probably more than just one single reflection, but one that did pop up particularly was the appropriateness of the methods that Fridays for Future use for the Global South, given the fundamentally different context that you come from. I mean, maybe in certain circles, that's a really obvious point, but to be honest, I'd never thought about it before. So that's really, really thought-provoking and has encouraged me to think, okay, what else am I missing? And there are so many other points, but just want to echo a huge thanks to Nisreen for spending your time with us. You've been really, really generous with your time. So very grateful. And a final plug, you can check out the next event, which is actually next week, which is quite unusual just because we won't do our normal event in late December. And it's kind of a follow-up to this one. So it's still about social movements, but it's about the role of business and finance and how we can get them lobbying for progressive change. So yeah, check out that link. And then I'll pass on to just Julie, I think is left, and Chloe.
Actually learned a lot, and for me, what really sticks out is how much time we think we have, but we don't really have all that time. And looking into what Nafia is all about, should hurry up. Everyone should. Yeah.
Yeah.
Nisreen, do you have a particular takeaway from today?
Yeah, I was just surprised that things I take for granted, people never think about it. So I think that we really need to reach more people and talk about different concepts and different point of views, because maybe people cares more, but they just don't understand. And it's our mission actually to make them understand so they can actually act. You cannot act on what you don't understand.
Thank you. Yeah, I think yeah, to echo Anna, just a huge thanks to you, and just the huge value of having you here, having this different perspective of the beautiful discussion that we had around the book and how that all fed in. I think it's definitely been one of my favorite sessions. I think just such a rich discussion and so many takeaways from today. But yeah, I'm just so glad that you are at COP and that there is a perspective like this that is actually there, because I think looking at this from a British perspective and thinking, God, that is so depressing. There, you know, only stuff happening outside of COP because they resonate with ATOL, and everything inside just seems so disappointing. So it's really great to know that you are there and have this platform, and that it's just been fantastic. So thank you so much. It would be great to see you all at the next session as well, and a big thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. I'm waving. Bye.